some point, right? But it actually worked out because we didn't have any topics to go over. So we were just going to do kind of a question and answer. Okay, so that couple new changes on those two new forms. We're going to talk about adding bidders after a bid has been sent, the process that we'll need to do that. We've talked about it a few months ago, but we want to make sure that we're doing that correctly. So that would be only for bids that are in a sent status when you need to add vendors after it's been sent. And then that kind of just brings up the comment or a topic of let's talk about bid amendments a little bit. We're going to talk about a couple notes there. When they're used, what can and can't be changed via bid amendment, those sorts of things. And then we will remind you of our monthly bid buy training, which will be next Wednesday, which is the second Wednesday of each month, as well as our bid buy practice sessions, and then close up with our fun fact of the day and quote of the day, or quotes of the day. We have two today. So first up, a new form alert. So two new forms have small changes to them. First up is the emergency purchase statement. So you'll see that there is a new version out there, version 22.1. The only change on the emergency purchase statement is the CPO signature box has been updated. So you'll see that there are two boxes that were added and a comment box, because if the emergency purchase statement is there on the extension, whenever you're doing an extension, the authorization could be there, but with the following changes. So that's just it's not really going to affect the way you would complete the form. However, there is an option there for the CPO to put in comments in the CPO signature box. Okay, pretty straightforward, and similar to the a new change on the purchase of motor vehicles exemption request form. Very small change, but it's something that's needed. There's a new field for the master contract number is added there. That wasn't on the previous version. So you'll see that there is a version 22.3. Now this form is not in the procurement resource library. This form is in the with the CPO notices, because CPO notice was posted, and so with the CPO notice listed there, that new form is listed right next to it. So let me go out real quick and just kind of show you. Again, this is the emergency purchase statement. Right, and you go down to the emergency purchase extension, and you'll see at the bottom, there it is. Right there, you have the new box for the comment and the two new boxes. Okay. So your emergency purchase extension will have a new box there. So version 22.1 is listed out there. And then on the purchase of motor vehicle exemption request form, or purchase of motor vehicles exemption request form, you can see that the master contract number has a field there that's listed. Okay. All right. Okay, so now we're going to talk about when you add a bidder after a bid has been in sent status. Okay, so we know that when you're following the job aids, you get to the bid stage, you're adding your vendors via NIGP code. We also know that there are sometimes when you look at that your bidders list there and see that maybe a vendor didn't sign up for all of the NIGP codes that they should have, and so you as the agency or the SPO, you do know, well, I know this vendor is out there, they should be on this, and they aren't. So we do see that from time to time. We do tell vendors that we want them to add multiple codes, add as many codes as they could possibly. We're going to be casting a wide net by using multiple NIGP codes, but we also want the vendors to also be casting a wide net in terms of their NIGP codes. But we also know sometimes that they are new to bid buy, maybe they didn't select all the NIGP codes that they should have, and we need to add additional bidders. Now, you can add bidders prior to this being sent, to the bid being sent, without having to do a bid amendment. But adding a bidder does not automatically notify the vendor. So if once a bid is published, and then the agency or the SPO realizes, hey, you know, this one vendor should be on this. We know that they can provide this good or service, and they're not on that list, which would mean that they were not notified of that solicitation opportunity. The system will allow you to add vendors, so you could just add and look up vendors there, but it doesn't automatically notify the vendor. Okay, so our best practice is going to be, we need to create a comment. We do a bid amendment and add a comment to that you're adding the vendors. So technically you're not creating a bid amendment in order to add vendors. We're going to be creating a bid amendment just to put in a comment so that then the vendors are notified. So the process is, first off, you want to notify the SPO, because the SPO is the only one that can apply those bid amendments. That's really important. So you're going to notify the SPO, you'll create a bid amendment, you'll go ahead and put in a comment that is just going to be adding additional vendors. You don't need to call out who is being added. The point here is just that a comment is added, because anytime you have a comment on a bid amendment, that will trigger a notification. No matter what, even if you select the don't show vendor, and so we're going to talk about that in just a second on the next slide. Even if you select not to show vendor for your bid amendment, but then put a comment, it does notify your vendors. So that's a little, a little just nuance of the system that we want to make sure you're aware of. So you'll create a bid amendment, put in the comment adding additional vendors, and then notify the SPO to apply that bid amendment. It's important that SPOs are the only ones that apply bid amendments, because the system shows, and hence the procurement file shows, what bid amendment and who applied the bid amendment. And so that's really important too. Just another reminder, maybe we haven't talked about that in a while either. Even if you are doing bid amendments to attach internal documents, those sorts of things, you want to be able to have the SPO apply all those bid amendments. And the job aid does call that out in the bid amendment section, that the agency creates and the SPO applies those bid amendments. And if you have any questions, talk to your SPO regarding that. Another note here, so this isn't going to affect your small purchases under $10,000, right? Because those informal quotes all take place within a requisition. So they're not going to even go to the bid stage. So you don't even do a bid amendment for that. In the case of a small purchase under 10, for those informal quotes, you're just not going to do this process. If you realize that a vendor is not on there that should be, aside from the first time that it goes out, right? So you have the option to either go directly to a small business set-aside program vendor if it's between 2,000 and 10,000, or if you're going to go out to all your small businesses, it's still set aside for small businesses. But let's say maybe I think the case where we would see this more often probably would be it goes out to small businesses. You get a waiver for any of the reasons, whether it's just too high, the quotes are too high, or no responses are received. And then you go out to all businesses with that NIGP code, and you notice that a vendor isn't on that list. That's probably where we're going to see that happen most likely, or most often. And in that case, you're just going to add the vendor to that list. There's no mechanism to put in an actual bid amendment. But once, for anything above $10,000, so certainly any of your small purchases above $10,000, and of course any of your IFBs, RFPs, those sorts of things. So, and then I guess just another reminder too, while we're talking about bid amendments, we'll go to our next slide here. I have a question. Will adding a new vendor change the RFP due date? That's probably going to be a case-by-case basis, because depending on when you add that vendor, so technically, it's a best practice here. Technically, if it's posted, it needs to be posted for 14 days, right? That vendor could access it. It's not like they can't access it. It would show up on in BidBuy. It's just that they're not going to be notified that they were added. So to answer your question, I guess that it probably would depend on when they were added, and I would just talk to your SPO regarding that. But in a short, let's say it gets published, you immediately realize that that one vendor or a couple vendors isn't on there. That's not going to automatically mean you have to change the RFP due date or IFB. Okay, but I would just speak to your SPO regarding that. Okay, so next up, so while we're talking about bid amendments, this just kind of seems like a good topic to go into. So let's just talk about bid amendments for a minute. Some common uses for bid amendments, and then a couple just nuances within bid buy. So some common uses for bid amendments, attaching a Q&A document. So for an IFB, an RFP, you have a certain date when questions come in. That's a part of your solicitation document, right? Then you get answers from the agency that goes through the SPO, right? Because the SPO has to review all those questions and answers. We want to make sure that no information is being put out to the vendors that isn't appropriate. So again, that's another reason why that SPO needs to apply the bid amendment, because they're going to be reviewing that Q&A. So you attach those Q&A, that's put out, showing to vendor, as well as putting a comment there that you're attaching the Q&A responses. Also, bid amendments can be used for updating certain fields. So the description, maybe there's a typo in there. We've seen that before, a typo in the description, and that's just kind of a correction there. Or a bid opening date. Maybe a bid is being extended. So that's certainly used there. Attaching internal documents is the only way to do that for a bid that's in a bid that's in a sent status. It's nothing that needs to be shown to the vendor, but you're still attaching documents into the procurement file. However, whenever you do that, be aware of that show vendor checkbox and the comment. So I mentioned it a few minutes ago, but just as a reminder, or to those that may not remember, if you put a comment in the comment box for a bid amendment, that will show the vendor. Even if you check or uncheck the show vendor box. So that, again, that's a nuance of the system. So if you're attaching just an internal document, uncheck the show to vendor, because it will default to show to vendor, because that's just the way the system is set up for our bid amendments. And then no comment there. It's not a big deal if you do put a comment, but however, that vendor is going to be, the vendors will see that bid amendment at that point. And then also common uses for bid amendments would be adding our vendors. And then I just put see previous slide, because technically you can add vendors without doing a bid amendment. But the reason is, again, the reason we want to do a bid amendment is to be able to notify the vendors that were added, because they're not going to be automatically notified. And again, this is all in the spirit of promoting competition. We want to make sure that vendor is notified as soon as possible, and transparency there. Okay, so that's what some of the common uses are for bid amendments. What cannot be changed via bid amendment? So the new pricing lockbox cannot be used. So this is going to be only used for the RFPs only. We talked about this a couple weeks ago. That's a new feature in version 16.1 in BidBuy. That pricing lockbox, you can't do a bid amendment to change that. So that's something that's going to be really important when you guys are creating the bid, important for the SPO as they are approving, and for those RFPs. Also, the rolling enrollment. So this is really only going to be used for your sole sources, renewals, small purchase with sole source conditions, or small purchase with emergency conditions. That rolling enrollment box is used whenever you check that box. You are allowed to immediately send the bid, and you're immediately able to open up and create a quote on behalf of the vendor prior to that bid opening date. If you do not check that rolling enrollment box on, like I said, the sole source, renewals, small purchase with sole source conditions, or small purchase with emergency conditions, you're going to have to wait until that bid opening date arrives to be able to go in and open the bid, and then follow the rest of those steps. So that's important too. That's just kind of being checked on the front end of that. And so again, those are listed on your job aids to check the rolling enrollment for those particular procurement methods, and just be aware that that cannot be changed via a bid amendment. Okay, I have a question here. What about show vendor confidential mean on the attachments? We've had a lot of questions about this lately. Sure, yes. Okay, so a couple weeks ago, and I'll add the slide regarding that as I send the follow-up, because that is a pretty common question. So the show vendor / confidential mean on the attachments tab. So you know what? It's probably going to be best if I just show you real quick. Let's see, we got a bid here in progress. We'll go with that. Okay, so in the attachments tab, we have the two options, right? In the job aid, it'll show you to check show to vendor or not, which attachments to check. And there's a slide a couple weeks ago that really kind of broke this down pretty well in terms of you do have the option at the bid stage to select show vendor or confidential. Now at the bid stage, so it really kind of all distills down to this. This is the best way to think about it. At the bid stage, show vendor means it's public to everybody. It shows the entire vendor community. If it does not say show vendor, it's not going to show at that bid. So that's pretty straightforward, right? It's either showing to the public because this is a bid stage and it's public to everybody, or not. However, if you mark it confidential at the bid stage, so you do have the option to mark those internal documents confidential, and all that means is when it gets pulled over to the PO stage, it will already be marked confidential. Okay. If once we get to the PO stage, if it's marked confidential, obviously it's not showing to the public. If it's marked show to the vendor at the PO stage, that means that that vendor can see that document. And so really the only document where you're going to see where it's marked show vendor and marked confidential is the fully executed contract. And so at the PO stage, if it's marked confidential, it can't be viewed publicly. If it's not marked confidential, you're going to be able to see it publicly. At the bid stage, again, if it's marked show to vendor, it's viewable to the public. If it's not show vendor, it's not going to be viewed. So the option of clicking confidential to it for an internal document at the bid stage really only means that once you convert it to PO, it will already be marked confidential. Now, our past practices were that the reason we don't call this out on the job aid to mark internal documents confidential at the bid stage is because that was a new one of the changes as a part of the updates, and the practice for most agencies was, well, at the PO, that's when you're marking all those documents confidential. Okay. Again, if you have any questions regarding that, please reach out to me, and I'll put that slide regarding the confidential confidential information as a part of this slide too when I add it out. Okay. I got another question here. When adding a vendor via bid amendment, if they are not registered under the NIGP code that was used, do you have to add all vendors under that NIGP code? And if it has already gone out to small business set-aside vendors, waiver approved, and out to all vendors, if you need to add a vendor under the other NIGP code, do you have to start all over with the smalls so that those vendors under that code are included as well? All right, so there's a lot going on there. My default in that situation is ask your SPO, because the short answer, I believe, is when you're adding vendors, it's because, well, we know that one vendor probably didn't select the NIGP codes they're supposed to. That's the situation that I've seen most often. But if you're going to be adding additional NIGP codes, then yes, I would make the argument that you would need to go back out to your smalls at that point. But again, I would have to take it case by case basis, because you could also look at it and say, well, if you looked at the vendors that are registered for the other additional NIGP code that you're adding, what if it was the same 3 vendors that were already solicited as a part of your other NIGP codes? Okay, so that's another way to think about this as well, is would it change the vendor pool at all? And if it would, if then it would bring over a lot more other vendors if you were using that other NIGP code, I would make an argument that yeah, you probably should have used that NIGP code to begin with, and and now that's just kind of a learning moment to use that additional NIGP code. I hope I was clear with that answer, but if not, please reach out to me and let me know. Okay, caught up on all of our. All right, perfect. Absolutely, thank you. All right, good question. That's a good real life question. We like those. Okay, and then so that was the rolling enrollment, and then just as a reminder, just be aware of that show vendor checkbox and use that appropriately, because if you are, well, why don't I show you real quick? Since I'm in train. We found a bid that's in sent status, if there are any here. Okay, so when I create an amendment, I have an amendment here, and you have that comment for the whole amendment. So when I say a comment, that's what's going on here. If you put a comment in there, the vendors will be able to see that bid amendment. If you don't, you wouldn't need to. Okay, so let's say I was going to go in and just change, I don't know, for this one, maybe this is a bad example in terms of changing the due date at this date and time, but you can see once you change something, you have the option over here on the right hand side. Do we want to show that to the vendor or not? Right? So in the case of adding an internal document, you don't need to show that to vendor, so you can uncheck that box. However, in this case, I'm actually changing the bid opening date. Of course, we want to see that there, and that's going to be shown to the vendor. In the case that I was talking about was adding an attachment, an internal document only. Okay, so now that's going to be, I'm going to uncheck. I don't want to show that to the vendor, right? But then also in the summary tab, I would uncheck that document. So when I put it to show to vendor, it already automatically marked it as no. If I were to go back to that attachment, you can see how that's going to change. If I make that to show vendor and save, when I go back to the summary tab, you're going to see that that's going to be showing to the vendor. Okay, so you'll just be aware of when you're attaching those internal documents. It's just one more thing that a vendor would see that they don't need to in that case. But just be aware that there's the option to show vendors. So for those things that you do need to show to the vendor, make sure you're not unchecking that box. So anytime you do create a bid amendment, you make any changes, it will default to show to vendor. However, like I said, if it's something that does not need to show to vendor, you can uncheck that box. Don't put a comment in there, and the vendor's not going to see that bid amendment. It'll just be internal only. Okay. All right. Next up, so next week we will we'll be offering our October Bid Buy monthly training. That occurs the second Wednesday of each month. For those of you that haven't been following along, every few weeks we bring this up. So next Wednesday, October 13th, all day bid buy training. This is perfect for anybody who needs a refresher to bid buy, or they need access to bid buy. This is the training that they need to go through to attend. We did make a slight change in times. If you'll notice, the first session is at 9 a.m. The second session is at 10:30. Previous versions, that small purchase session started at 10:15. We just bumped that back a little bit to give us to be able to have a little break in between. So 9 o'clock, 10:30, take a break for lunch. 1 p.m. we'll do small purchase over 10, and then finish up our last session at 3 p.m. for release off of master. Also, The BidBuy practice sessions will be available next Thursday, so the day after our BidBuy training. Those occur the second and third Thursdays of each month at 9 a.m. Those are they're there for informal practice, run through examples, be able to share screens, maybe have a smaller group to work through real life examples, those sorts of things. And then the links to those trainings are in our training center as usual. This is the slide that I just kind of keep up there, where you can find our calendar of events, where you can find past training Tuesdays, for all of our training material. Okay, so our fun fact of the day. The most expensive book ever sold was the Codex Leicester, which was bought by Bill Gates in 1994 for $30.8 million, which now for 2021 dollars is about $54.4 million. So what's so cool about it? It was Da Vinci's science diary created in 1510. It contains all his drawings, all his theories, all his observations, all this stuff. It's super cool. Another thing that is really cool about Da Vinci, I know you can't really see it there, but he was left-handed and he wrote backwards. So it's actually mirrored writing, which is pretty interesting because back then, right, if you're a lefty, you would smudge your writing. So if you look at those, it's pretty cool. There's some cool videos out there of Bill Gates, what he took it and flipped it, and it's all kind of hands-on where you can view it, view the real thing, but but it's mirrored. Pretty cool. There's some cool videos out there. And then our quote of the day, I actually picked two today. People who wonder if the glass is half empty or half full miss the point. The glass is refillable. So every day we get a new opportunity. And then the old Zig Ziglar, love him. People often say that motivation doesn't last. Well, neither does bathing. That's why we recommend it daily. All right, everybody. Let me know if you have any questions. These will be posted per usual. And we'll see you later. Have a great rest of your week. Thank you.